Thank you for coming, Ellen. Ellen Dorsey, she's the executive director of Wallace Global Fund, which has played a huge role in the fossil fuel divestment movement, which included the renowned Divest Invest Initiative, as well as many other components to it. The point of it all is moving capital away from fossil fuels and into climate solutions. So, Ellen, I'm going to ask you some questions about your work cultivating this movement. Let's go. So, can you tell us again, Ellen, what was the inception of this initiative like? How did you get from the point of somebody must do something to the point of knowing that you're going to do this initiative and ready to take the first steps?
Great, thank you so much. Maybe I can lean in a little bit time-wise on the first question or two and a little lighter, in the later ones.
Yeah, go ahead.
So first, let me say that the global movement of people calling for divestment from fossil fuels and investment in climate solutions is just that, a rare global social movement made up of individuals and a loose network of distributed groups aligning to advance a set of objectives to unlock profound social or environmental change, taking action with common strategies that help build power and create momentum. And ultimately, movements operate as in a kind of hydra-headed way. It's important to note, therefore, that movements have many origin stories and movements have many mothers. But movements can't really be created, but fertile ground can be created, and innovative strategies and dedicated organizing can help lead to a movement. I give that context because it is so important to understand that this actually is a global social movement. At the inception of this initiative from my perch at Wallace Global Fund, a climate, democracy, and justice funder, remember back in 2009, 2010, Copenhagen failed, Waxman Markey, other efforts at US policy failed, policy was failing around the world. Why? Well, corporate capture of government was primarily the reason why. We didn't have a real climate movement. We had pockets of advocacy, NGOs and leaders. Climate advocacy was focused on educating about the science and fighting the impacts of climate change, and often like busing students down to DC to lobby for failed public policy of the day, right? So it was important, we felt, that we had to turn the focus on the fossil fuel industry, and that figuratively students should be kicking stuff up on campuses in ways that lead to pretty significant change, because that it always has. That's always been a necessary ingredient. So we began to have internal discussions at our foundation that maybe we could take a play from the anti-apartheid playbook, that we could turn to divestment as a people's tool for going after industry rather than legislation, and to do it as a moral or ethical imperative, starting with universities, that you can't invest in the companies with your endowments that you're training and educating your students on, that are leading the crisis that you're training and educating your students on, while sprinkling in a little bit of campus clean stuff, right? That is just a profound contradiction, and that divestment activism is an animating way to engage students to go after the industry. So we began to discuss how we could test and experiment and look at bringing students together. And that was happening at the same time as our own foundation was experimenting with our own investment portfolio. And we began divesting from fossil fuels and mining, investing in climate solutions that center communities, and doing shareholder engagement to decarbonize all the rest. So how's that for a table setting?
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Ellen. Let's move to the next question. So, how did you get, so to speak, the first members into the movement? Who were some of the first main stakeholders you brought on board? What were you asking of them? How did you approach designing what to ask of them that would be compelling and practical for them?
So we were already funding some student climate advocacy, some organizations mobilizing students, particularly some student campus coal work, We had been funding other efforts at analyzing the financing of fossil fuels. But we began to research whether there were any groups going after the financing of fossil fuels as a dedicated strategy. We identified a group of student enviro leaders and also campus campaigns on coal. There was an organization that supported student endowment campaigns not related to climate or fossil fuels. And we discovered that the students at Swarthmore and one of their faculty members were starting to talk about, could we do a kind of divestment campaign? So we convened a meeting in 2011 at our offices and tested and debated and flip charted and agreed that we'd walk out of that meeting and test divestment on 8 campuses starting that school year. And some would lead with coal divestment, some would lead with fossil fuel divestment, some would lead it with the invest side to see if that would be a more compelling way to test what would work. Um, and so the campaign started on the 8 campuses in September. By the end of that academic year, there were 40 campaigns with very little work actually to get there. And then during 2011, Carbon Tracker Initiative published their unburnable carbon report about stranded asset risk in investment portfolios. Basically, if you don't know this argument, it says that 80% of the coal that fossil fuels that companies have in their reserves are unburnable. They're stranded assets to investors if we're going to stay below 2 degrees. So Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben kind of married up this divestment stuff brewing on campus with carbon trackers analysis. And now we didn't just have a moral imperative to divest, we had a financial imperative to divest, which really strengthened the case. So at that point, and this is where I'll give a little bit more of context and promise to be uh, I'll be longer later when we talk about what happened.
Mhm.
But basically, at this point, we had the seeds of the most powerful arguments to begin to mobilize what led to this global movement.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah, indeed, a very powerful argument, appealing to, you're investing in assets that you can't leverage without investing in a world that doesn't have an economy in the first place at some point. So yeah, Ellen, can you say a bit more about what was the operational day-to-day work of cultivating this movement like in the first couple of years, especially?
Um, Wild because we didn't actually expect to get in the center of what became a global movement. So we seeded needed research. We funded various organizations that brought specific skills to get in behind this exploding movement and support the activism with particular training or skill development or whatever. We created new hubs of organizing to take the activism out to new sectors. So from students to faith to pensions to cities, across geographies, it started to explode globally. We created hubs of organizing in Europe and Australia with funders in Europe and Australia and Asia. We seeded new investment products so that there will be fossil-free funds. We organized philanthropy as actually a sector of the movement. Divest Invest Philanthropy. Took me a year. I got 17 foundations to agree to come out together and announce they were doing it. And we sent letters to the top 3,000 foundations in the US and saying, if you own fossil fuels, you own climate change. Divest, invest. We thought it was important that philanthropy was organized as a sector of the movement because we could move quickly, put wind at the back of the sails of the students, create demand for fossil-free investment products, and then hold up our portfolios and say, see, you can do it. Don't say you can't do this to tell your investment committee that actually look at these foundations that have done it. We created a network to help the coordination of the movement so that we created leadership trainings. We funded a state of the movement report. We helped host with the network of groups press conferences where new announcements of new divestment commitments were made, whether it was the Rockefeller Foundations and Family or the World Council of Churches. And we did that all at key moments to try and have maximum political influence and build the momentum of the movement and begin to put pressure on governments to pull away from that fossil fuel capture. Wild stories. We were constantly small foundation going, okay, gotta go to the Vatican. We've got this process going with the Vatican. Okay, let's get the UN to bring divestment in as one of its formal commitments, the people's commitments. And they're saying, can you get important people to make these announcements? Like, it was just wild. It just kept on exploding and exploding. But most importantly, we followed behind the exploding activism. We were trying to assist the leaders, help support opportunities that were created, troubleshoot problems that came up, or try and just raise resources for the movement to continue its explosive growth.
Amazing. Wow, that is really, really impressive. I'm not at all surprised that this work was so renowned. So thank you for doing all of that, Ellen. And let's talk a little bit more about movement leadership here. So as I understand correctly, over time, this movement became truly distributed and developed distributed leadership and was not dependent on just you doing everything, right? So how did you cultivate that distributed leadership? And also, how did you balance alignment on movement goals versus autonomy of what the leaders do?
I'll be quick on this question and hopefully the next one. I mean, initially we did help identify leaders and cultivate them, but mostly over time, I mean, this is the beauty of movements, and this is the beauty, frankly, of youth activism, which spirals into much wider public activism. The leaders self-identified. Our role was to then, as we started to see things popping up here and there, it's like, okay, how do we help this? How do we help connect? So our role was to support, create connective tissue between them, and provide resources that were required to support them. Like I said, like the kind of trainings that they needed to be able to go in and talk to investment committees about fiduciary issues, to support the emergence of new activism, new strategies, or just send pizza to students when they were staging sit-ins for a week and needed to be fed. Like it was just following behind. It was so explosive in growth and truly hydra-headed that alignment was remarkably strong. But there was so much innovation and creativity that really it was at that point about helping to coordinate and help groups pivot to go after new strategies like going after banks and insurance companies, et cetera. With strong identified leaders, student leaders, Bill McKibben, 350, prominent faith leaders, mayors, funders, et cetera, they were out there, but really it was the unknown individuals who were driving the movement, and their autonomy is a measure of success. If individuals see their own agency and create pathways for action, organizing others to come with them, a movement will build, and it did.
Thank you, Alan. And last question, maybe we can spend about 2 minutes on this one. After all this time seeing this movement in action, what are some of the choices that you made where you're like, oh man, I'm so glad we did this right? It really would not have been as impactful as if we didn't get that right. What were some of the choices like that?
Three things. Already said it a million times. We invested in youth leadership as the force to launch a campaign, which became a movement. Second, bringing it out to leaders and organizations working in other sectors strategically. Let's go after cities now. Let's go after faith. Let's go after pension funds. And then organizing philanthropy to be a sector of the movement was a very debated decision in our foundation. There were some that didn't think it was a good use of our time. I think in retrospect it was. And then being you know, committing to creating conditions for the success of the movement, like creating state of the movement reports, press events, to amplify the power and impact of the movement, to create rolling momentum. We were utterly committed to constantly creating that rolling momentum and projecting the power of the movement. So
Mhm.
just to wrap, what began in 2011, what led to the first big state of the movement announcement report of 52 billion in assets under management divested in 2014 has now led to 41 trillion in assets under management being divested today. Investing in the very first student activists led to the creation of the Sunrise Movement. The founders and many of the Sunrise activists met through the divestment movement, which led to the demands for the Green New Deal, which led to the political pressure that led to the Build Back Better and ultimately the IRA. Now, the IRA wasn't everything that we wanted, but it was politicians legislating on climate despite continued enormous but weakened power of the fossil fuel industry. Ultimately, that was the goal of the movement.
Incredible. Wow, this is really inspiring, Ellen. Thank you so much for sharing this.